Mahler broke away the so-called classical form. There's a symphonic poem, if you want, the creation of the world there.
His music is a sort of never-ending cornucopia of magic. Apart from being universal, it goes on expanding and growing like the expanding universe.
You can't listen to Gustav Mahler's music and not confront the question of music as an expression of life.
Gustav Mahler was born on the 7th of July, 1860, in Kaliszta, Bohemia, a Czech province of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was the son of Marie and Bernard Mahler, a Jewish innkeeper. Gustav was the second of 14 children, and soon after his birth, his family moved to Iglau, now Jihlava in the Czech Republic. It was here, in this garrison town, on the road from Prague to Vienna, that Mahler's early childhood experiences had a profound influence on his musical life.
Mahler grew up in a small village, and he must have, as people in villages do, have a very strong appreciation of the purposes for which music is most fundamentally used in society: to march off to war, to mourn the dead, to serenade one's loved ones, to sing when the crops are brought in. All of these basic, primal reasons for which every culture develops music.
He very early knew songs, and he had a little accordion, and he used to go around the town and to play these songs on the accordion. And one day he's supposed to have walked out of the house and followed the soldiers with his little accordion, and this is of course how one realized that he was so gifted musically. His father understood that he should not contradict this tremendous vocation that Gustav Mahler had from youth on, and that he must allow it to develop.
Mahler was Jewish, but his musical education began as a chorister in Iglau's Catholic church, and he was given piano lessons by the choir master. But tragically, his musical growth was accompanied by the sudden deaths of many of his brothers and sisters. In all, 9 out of 14 children died during Mahler's early life. At the age of 6, he attempted his first composition, ironically, a polka with an introductory funeral march.
He saw much-loved brothers and sisters being taken off from one day to the next, carried out of the back door, and lost forever. Meanwhile, through the front door came people into the tavern for merriment, for jollity, for drink. So the experience of death is casualized, trivialized, and at the same time intermingled with a kind of bizarre, macabre jollity that is quite clearly heard within his music.
Mahler learnt about irony before he learnt about life. The omnipresence of funeral marches in his music, in every symphony. There is a funeral march of sorts. He was surrounded by death. He was near the military barracks, where he would hear those bugle calls, and somehow that was a kind of symbolism of war, of conflict.
At home, Mahler's life was far from idyllic. His father had a reputation for violence, and the boy often witnessed brutal scenes between his parents. One incident left an indelible imprint on his memory. During a particularly violent row, he was so frightened he ran out onto the street where an organ grinder was playing a popular song, Auch du lieber Augustin. This contrast between the tragic and the banal would later become a hallmark of Mahler's musical style. But meanwhile, Bernard Mahler, despite his irrational behavior, was astute enough to encourage the young Gustav's talents rather than force him into the family business.
He allowed his son to start a life as a musician, which was obviously not the best way of making money. So that proves that he was a man who knew what art was, and he realized that the gifts were strong enough that only in the Vienna Conservatory could they be realized.
The Piano Quartet is Mahler's only surviving student composition, inspired by the composers Brahms and Schumann, and written when he was 15. At the Vienna Conservatory, Mahler fell under the spell of the then controversial composer Richard Wagner. As a piano student, he won several prizes, but soon realized that his dream was to compose, and quickly acquired a distinctive style of his own.
The very early works have in them already manifest the Mahler that we meet continuously until the end of his life. A case in point is the Klagende Lied, that early cantata, which, if you study it, has so many of the fully developed features and some of the most original features which we value most of the Mahler of his maturity.
It's all about music from the forests, hunting horns, military music, folk songs, everything. And Klagende Lied very courageously presents that music, almost unadorned to us. We have this echo of hunting horns right at the beginning. Normal horns would have gone, but Mahler's horns go in the cracks between the harmonies. Where do I belong? In the major side of things or the minor side of things? And that was his question for his entire life.
Mahler entered Das Klagende Lied for the Beethoven Prize in Vienna in an attempt to launch a composing career. But the jury failed to appreciate its originality, and devastated, Mahler had to consider a career as an opera conductor rather than as a composer.
He said to friends, if I had got this reward, I would not have been compelled to go to the theater, but I think that's nonsense. Because a reward of about 500 or 600 guilders cannot nourish him for so many years. And it would not have influenced his career as a composer. He learned a lot about the orchestra when he was conducting. That was an excellent school for him.
Mahler secured a number of posts at leading opera houses, amongst them Budapest and Prague. He also gained a reputation as a womanizer, including a string of affairs with leading sopranos. In 1886, he started his first symphony, conceived as a symphonic poem called The Titan. It is the story of a hero, Mahler himself, and his journey through life to death.
It's extraordinary to me that Mahler started exactly as he meant to go on. At the age of 29, he created a first symphony that was like a manifesto of his intentions in the future. And the very opening bars, where this extraordinary character kind of emerges from a brave new dawn to face this uncertain future, is hypnotic. At first, it's almost imperceptible, the sound we hear. This hazy, dewy, harmonic, And it's only when your ear becomes attuned to it as a sound that you suddenly realize that it stretches right the way down through the orchestra, through many, many octaves. And then you get these parched woodwinds, these strange little flurries of fanfares and little bird calls high in the oboes. And it's like, I mean, I can't imagine how this music must have sounded to audiences in 1889.
The first movement is as long as a Mozart symphony. Mahler had the first idea from here, how to break the classical symphony, if you want it. Maybe it's too outrageous to say such a thing. Maybe he hadn't thought of that. Maybe he wanted to write a classical symphony, but it broke the length and the whole duration of a Mahlerian symphony is much bigger than any classical symphony.
While Mahler was director of the opera at Budapest, he found an opportunity to give the premiere of his first symphony. It was a disaster. The orchestra found it too difficult, the critics hated it, and the audience were baffled.
It's obvious that a work as original as the First Symphony, which included a very strange movement based on the folk song Frère Jacques, and which is treated as a grotesque funeral march, could not possibly have been understood by the public. And Mahler himself later said that he walked for several days after the performance in the street of Budapest with everybody avoiding him and thinking of him as a madman.
While he was writing the First Symphony, Mahler also composed his first major song cycle, Lieder eines fahrenden Gesellen, or Songs of a Wayfarer, inspired by the lure of nature. He integrated some of this music into his First Symphony.
The relationship to the Fahrenden Gesellen Lieder to the First Symphony is very obvious. The themes are wandering in and out and all through. I think that it was his first major work and first germination of a major thought process where this bounding head over heels of song to symphony and symphony to song starts its gestation, really.
The Gesellenlieder were inspired by an anthology of folk texts known as Des Knaben Wunderhorn, or Youth's Magic Horn, which Mahler had known since his childhood. They encapsulate many of the experiences of Mahler's early life, and he used the texts of Des Knaben Wunderhorn in his next 3 symphonies.
There was something about these poems that captured his imagination. They were full of nocturnal imaginings. They were full of whimsical kind of fairy tale charm and a grim irony, which Mahler immediately latched onto. So these songs were an enormous influence in these early symphonies, and they formed kind of an emotional climacteric, if you like, of these pieces.
Und will das Liedlein nicht singen kann, dem wollen sie es pfeifen, ja.
Mahler had developed a fantastic reputation as a conductor, but had gained notoriety for insisting on long and arduous rehearsals to achieve perfection. He was forced to leave Budapest as a result of nationalist intrigues, but at the same time secured another post at the Hamburg Opera as music director. Mahler now decided to devote the months of his summer holidays entirely to composing. The stunning and awe-inspiring scenery at Steinbach on the Lake of the Attersee in Austria was the perfect spot to stimulate his creativity. So it was here, in 1891, when Mahler was 30, that he built his first composing hut.
The result of these summers of the Hamburg period are the two biggest symphonies practically that he ever composed, which are the Second and the Third Symphony. And these were composed largely in Steinbach am Attersee, where he was able to find the peace and the quiet to compose what he himself called symphonic universes.
In his Second Symphony, Mahler tried to come to terms with his religious convictions. A confirmed agnostic, he struggled with the notions of immortality and salvation in this symphony. He then expanded these ideas in the Third and Fourth Symphonies to celebrate the whole of creation.
This hut here in Steinbach is the first of the huts that Mahler had built for his summer composing. And it was here that he composed two or three of the Kanal and Wunderhorn songs. It was also here that he worked on the Second and Third Symphonies. It's a fantastic place. To think out of this hut comes this incredible natural universe that explodes into the Second Symphony.
The Second Symphony really just turned symphonic composition on its head. It came off the first in the sense that the hero of the First Symphony, the Titan of the First Symphony, was, if you like, being borne to his grave amidst all kinds of questions about why he had lived. And of course the hero was Mahler himself. What was the meaning of life? Would the meaning of life be revealed in death? Was it all some kind of joke? All these inner uncertainties which he was wrestling with all his life, the agnostic in him really came to the surface.
Mahler's music is incredibly emotionally charged in so many different ways, not just in a sad, but also in a fantastically beautiful, hopeful way. And when I sing Mahler's music, or even just learn a piece I haven't done before, I have to go through a whole period of discovery and a whole emotional period. He finds true beauty, which is that ugliness is sometimes beautiful in its truth, in its reality. And even his key relationships, he never returns sometimes to a key, but that's like life, it evolves, and his motifs that he works with in symphonies and songs, they evolve. And that's what he said himself, it's nature.
In February 1895, Mahler received the tragic news that his favorite brother, Otto, had shot himself. Mahler was profoundly shocked and had always considered Otto a more talented musician than himself. At the same time, the financial restraints at Hamburg gave Mahler less opportunities to achieve his ambitious artistic goals. He tried secretly to maneuver himself into the most prestigious musical post in Europe, that of the director of the Vienna State Opera. Only one obstacle stood in his way. He was a Jew. If he wanted the job, he would have to adopt the official state religion.
Mahler's conversion to Catholicism was totally functional. He did it, as he made absolutely clear at the time, purely to get the job. When he came out of the church in which he was baptized, he bumped into one of his acquaintances, a critic called Ludwig Karpat, and he said to him, "I've just changed my coat," meaning the person inside remains the same. He did not subscribe to any particular religion. He had a very sincere belief in God, the creator of the universe, but he wasn't going to be pinned down to any canon or any credo. He was going to continue searching for what he felt was perhaps the true belief.
In May 1897, at the age of 36, Mahler was appointed music director of the Vienna Opera, with limitless powers to hire and fire whom he wished. Within a few months, he had won huge critical acclaim, but these results were not achieved easily.
His relations to the orchestra were very complicated. He dismissed many musicians and engaged new musicians, especially in the brass and the woodwinds. And I think that many musicians hated him because they feared him.
He was not only just the conductor, but he was the producer, the stage manager, the lighting and everything. I mean, he knew exactly what he wanted for the presentation of these operas, and he was a total dictator, and he was totally ruthless too, as far as sacking people was concerned. He got rid of incompetent stage hands. He was a terror from all accounts, and yet, of course, the results were fabulous.
Mahler arrived in Vienna at the most exciting moment in its cultural and artistic history. A new, experimental and adventurous group of artists, led by the painter Gustav Klimt, had recently broken away from the unimaginative and conservative Vienna Academy of Arts. They called themselves the Secessionist Movement, and at the State Opera, Mahler supported this movement by using one of their designers, Alfred Roller, to create new stagings for his productions. In the sphere of music, Mahler's reforms and ideals inspired a young avant-garde group of musicians who gathered around the composer Arnold Schoenberg. In his own music, Mahler began his Fourth Symphony, the last to be linked to the Wunderhorn texts. He also started to search for a new summer refuge, where he could compose in the same peace and tranquility he had enjoyed at Steinbach.
In 1901, he decided to build a house of his own. And for this, he selected Carinthia, which is the sunniest part of Austria. And he built a house on the edge of the Wörthersee. There was a forest going straight down to the lake. So the house was built by the lake, but there was a little path traced in the forest up to this little Häuschen in which he composed all the symphonies from the fourth on.
He came up in the morning here at 6 o'clock, was all alone. He had a little piano in here and a bookshelf with works by Kant and Goethe and notes by Bach. The cook had to bring up the coffee in the morning, and she had to take another path through the woods because he didn't want to see anybody in the morning.
When you've got these sounds in your mind, I mean, to actually get them down on paper, how do you do it? I mean, it's the most extraordinary sort of magical process, and I think anything that interferes with it, imagine, you know, any moment in any of the symphonies, someone coming and say, "Dinner's ready!" You know, I mean, it's gone. It would be gone. I mean, you'd have to get it back again. And I think he lived in this world of amazing sounds that no one had ever heard before. And as I say, anything, whether it was a child crying or a bird singing, would freak him out.
He's always been made out to be a sort of self-obsessed neurasthenic megalomaniac, whereas obviously he was an extremely practical man. You don't run opera companies like Hamburg and Vienna unless you're very practical, unless you're a superb businessman, and he was all these things.
Mahler had had little critical success with his own music, but nevertheless he was at the height of his creative powers, forging ahead with his Fifth Symphony. His work at the State Opera had made him the most famous, and after the Emperor, the most revered man in Vienna. His intrigues and machinations at the opera were recounted daily in the newspapers. Even the taxi drivers would point him out in the street. In November 1901, when he was 41, he was introduced to Alma Schindler. She was an accomplished pianist and composer, but more importantly, at 22, she was one of the most alluring women in Vienna and had already attracted the attention of the city's most famous artists. It wasn't long before Mahler fell under her spell.
He was entranced by Alma, who was an extraordinarily beautiful woman. You know, and Mahler was no oil painting, let's face it, and he was about 2 feet shorter than she was. So he looked up to her in all sorts of ways, but he was jealous of her, and you know, and that there were men in her life that he, you know, took exception to.
She ensnared Gustav Klimt, who was certainly the finest artist in Vienna before she was 18 years old. She then had the young composer Alexander von Zemlinsky, and she passed him over when she met Mahler and thought, wow, I've got the greatest man in Vienna, I'm going to cling to him.
The most excitement about Alma is, oh, how marvelous, all those famous men, how did she do it, kind of thing. Who was she? But, you know, she had her own inner life, and of course, it happened to her quite naturally. They were all in her milieu. They happened to be these wonderful men at this wonderful time. She had something which is indeterminate. It's very difficult to describe. It wasn't the physical beauty, but she had a luminosity. And she was interesting herself.
For a man who remained a man of provincial origin, all these things were absolutely fascinating. And also she was completely fascinated because she had this great instinct for genius. She knew he was the greatest musician in Vienna, the most famous person in Vienna. And being the wife of a famous man was obviously what she felt was her mission.
Within 4 months of their meeting, Mahler married Alma in Vienna's Karlskirche. This was the happiest period of Mahler's life, and Alma advised and assisted him in the composition of his Fifth Symphony.
Perhaps the most famous part of the Fifth Symphony is the penultimate movement, the Adagietto, primarily because of its repeated appearance on the soundtrack of Luchino Visconti's film Death in Venice. When Death in Venice was first shown at a private screening to the producers in Hollywood, producer said, hey, who wrote the music for this thing? And someone turned around and said, oh, Gustav Mahler. And he says, can we sign him? The piece is something very, very spiritual and very spare and very simple in many ways. Many people would describe it as a love song or a love letter to Alma, but I think the Adagietto is as much about Mahler and Mahler's solitude and his inwardness.
during the most blissful period of his life, Mahler wrote some of his darkest music. From the Fifth Symphony onwards, there is a shift in his artistic perspective. His symphonies are no longer a search for a spiritual existence. They are about the tragedies of human experience.
The premonition, I think, of the trilogy, of the three internal symphony of his, the fifth, the sixth, and the seventh, which, for whatever reason, each one starts with the Marcia Funebre, Trauer March, is a premonition to death, which started so early in his life. Because one is a pa-pa-pa-pa, 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 and the other one, bum, 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 is a march of the sixth. But at the end, if you analyze the mood and the spirit of that music, is a Trauer March. And then look at the beginning of the seventh. Ta, 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 brrr. And again, the same rhythm. And then the big trombone melody starts. I think there is something in those three symphonies which makes such an unity in the sense of the development. One symphony from the previous one, certainly, but also mood-wise, this need to elaborate a concept of the Marcia Funebre, Trauer March. And this, I think, was a kind of unbearable premonition for the tragedies which will follow in his life.
In his next symphony, Mahler tried to come to terms with the idea of his own fate. The Sixth Symphony is a psychological study of Mahler's emotional responses to his own impending sense of doom.
What a person thinking played in the music. And he develops out of that this marvelous Freudian idea that not what you see on him, but what he thinks, what he feels.
He had these black moments of despair, these downward spirals of thinking, yes, there's a pattern, everything is going to turn out badly again, the musicians won't like me, they won't like my piece, I'll have problems with the singers, I'll have to leave town again, they'll say I'm a Jew again. It was, that was certainly part of his nature. He had to really set down what that was so that he could be free of it.
The last movement of the Sixth Symphony includes some of the most emotionally charged and frightening music Mahler would ever write.
I've, for a long time, found the Sixth Symphony the one work that I really don't want to hear. I find it so powerful that I'm frightened that if I went to a live performance, it would almost be the sort of thing that could give me a heart attack. I mean, the finale is so overwhelming. And I haven't listened to it either live or on record for something like 20 years now. But I can still think the whole piece through, which is enough.
With the arrival of their second child, Alma began to object to Mahler spending so much time away from his family, particularly during the summer months while he was composing. Even when he wasn't composing, he would set off, again on his own, in pursuit of nature, going for walks in the mountains, cycling, as well as swimming or rowing on the Lake of the Wörthersee. During his scarce moments at home, his interests would rarely coincide with those of his wife.
He was a very intellectual man, fantastically well read, Plato, Goethe, all the German philosophers. And in a way, you can feel sorry for Alma because his idea of a cozy evening was to sit down and read aloud from these books when she would like to have gone to a party. So you can see why, in the end, things didn't go too well in that marriage.
He was a very sort of highly strung, nervous character. Fond of children, but at certain times, wouldn't want them around all the time. And slightly at odds with his wife, loved her, but didn't want her stealing his thunder. She was a composer too, and kept her under his thumb.
There must have been a lot of resentments. After all, she was an instinctive deeply temperamental, you know, with a lot of inner power, a lot of powerful temperament. It took her a long time, I think, to understand how great Mahler was. He was a great conductor. He was a great personage. She felt his power, the power of his personality, but I think that his music didn't, until much later, really move her. So that she felt that this was a beautiful thing she was doing, to give herself to his music rather than her own. But I think it took its toll humanly on her from inside.
Alma also objected to Mahler composing the Kindertotenlieder, or Songs on the Death of Children, based on text by Ruckert. With 2 children of their own, Alma found the songs distasteful. But Mahler had begun the cycle before his marriage, and he strongly identified with Ruckert's moving poetry.
If there's a personal element to this cycle, it's from Ruckert himself. And he wrote 400 songs on the death of children. But he wrote poetry in the first person, in the first hand of experience. And Mahler writes in a letter why Ruckert poetry after Das Knaben Wunderhorn, because after Das Knaben Wunderhorn, which he took as a collection of poetry that he could use from the first hand, first person experience, not even in a poetic or linguistic sense, but literally a narration of this happened to that person, the only poet he felt he could go to after that was in fact Ruckert.
The Kindertotenlieder focus on the raw emotion of dealing with death and even worse, your children dying. And each song kind of looks around at the world and sees nature in every image. And also the anger, like in the last song. It's storming, it's raining, it's terrible. And the music storms even more than the words, the way Mahler said it. And I think all of these songs of the Kindertotenlieder are terribly painful.
He wrote these songs on the death of children, Kindertotenlieder, and sure enough, one of his little children died in rather tragic circumstances, and he felt haunted by that. I think he was in fact haunted by death throughout. It was a constant theme in his music.
He must have had on top of it a feeling of strange guilt, because she asked him not to write the songs, and he did. And the subject matter, and it must have been a terrible shock.
He dropped everything and went away, left her to handle the funeral, told her to sell the house, and went off walking in the mountains to find, as he said, solace for his own troubled heart. He didn't actually pay any attention to her suffering. He was prepared to let her suffer alone, so that in that sense, yes, the death of the daughter was something that pulled them apart, but it wasn't perhaps the tragedy itself as the way that Mahler in particular reacted to it.
In a bizarre premonition, Mahler had superstitiously predicted his future in his earlier Sixth Symphony by writing what he called the 3 hammer blows of fate in the last movement. Now they would return to haunt him. Within a few weeks of his daughter's death, he himself was diagnosed with a heart condition. Then he was forced to resign from the Vienna Opera after a vicious anti-Semitic press campaign accused him of spending too much time away from the opera while conducting his own music abroad.
Mahler put up on the notice board his farewell message to the opera company, saying, you know, what he'd striven for, and sometimes they'd been successful and sometimes they hadn't, and thanking them all for what they'd done, and it was found ripped to pieces on the floor. So he was ruthless, and there were a lot of enemies.
Suddenly, over the space of a few weeks, he'd lost the only job he ever wanted, director of the opera in Vienna. He'd lost his beloved elder child, and he'd been told that he had to live the rest of his life as a semi-invalid, that he couldn't take the vigorous exercise that he loved to take, that he felt he needed. So to him, it felt like a death sentence.
Mahler completed his 8th symphony only a few weeks before his daughter died. Now he feared his own death. In the shadow of Beethoven, Schubert, and Bruckner, all of whom died after completing their 9th symphony, Mahler was too superstitious to write his own 9th. Instead, he composed a symphonic song cycle based on ancient Buddhist texts, recently translated from the Chinese. He called it Song of the Earth.
This head over heels of song and symphony and song and so forth culminates in what is, quite frankly, a song and a symphony together. And we have sung moments and symphonic moments. It's the complete synthesis. I think you could go through Das Lied von der Erde and probably find a germ of every piece of music he ever wrote. I think it's a huge testament.
It's a farewell, but it's having come to terms with the fight through life and come out the other side and realizing it's all spirit, and that all the things around us, the things we own, and say the bad feelings we might have about people, they just shed and just pure love.
He's no longer talking about resurrection. He's found his true religion, if you like, as a pantheist. I believe he had. And that is what's so incredibly moving about Das Lied von der Erde, because he's returning to the earth.
The Buddhist philosophy, which I think is very strong in parts of the Lied von der Erde, the acceptance of oblivion, resignation to mortality, reconciliation to the idea of mortality. Because remember, Das Lied von der Erde dissolves in a wonderful burst of radiance, not in depression, but in radiance of oneness, if you like, with the world.
Mahler had resigned from the greatest musical institution in Europe. Now he was approached by the world-renowned Metropolitan Opera in New York. Its manager, Heinrich Conried, asked Mahler to become the company's music director.
To be the chief director of the opera house in Vienna, he had to do 100 operas, not only conduct them, but direct them, and deal with the administration of the opera house. All that for $3,000 a year, which was a sizable amount of money, perhaps one of the larger fees in Europe. The director of the Metropolitan Opera, however, was willing to pay him $15,000 for 3 months' work. Now, what would you do? Mahler wanted to compose. He wanted to be in peace and quiet. He knew he was ill, and he wanted to be able to leave his family financially secure. And so when he was offered $15,000 for 3 months' work, he said, "I'll be right over."
There was this very touching scene one morning in December 1907 when Mahler and Alma turned up on the railway platform in Vienna, and the whole of Viennese cultural life had turned out on the platform to greet them. And as the train pulled out, Gustav Klimt, the great artist, uttered the fateful word, "Vorbei, it's over." And what he meant was that the revolution, the cultural revolution in Vienna was over. The progressive forces that Mahler had represented, the reform, the belief in a new art had gone with Mahler on that train to a new world, to another place.
Mahler arrived in New York to face yet more political infighting and intrigues. Very soon Conried was given the sack, and his replacement insisted on bringing a young, ambitious Italian conductor to the Met, one Arturo Toscanini. Mahler realized that the Met wasn't big enough for both of them. So he took up an offer to conduct the New York Philharmonic, his first major post as chief conductor of a symphony orchestra. During their summer holidays, the Mahlers could no longer bear to live at Meiernig after their daughter's death. Instead, they found a spot in the Tyrol at Toblach, where Gustav was able to continue composing during the summer months. He built his third composing hut in 1908 when he was 48, and it was here that he wrote his last music.
Everyone thinks of the last movement with this tremendously emotional adagio, which is certainly one of the most moving pieces ever written by anyone. But one forgets that there are moments in which the desire to live and to work and to exist in every possible way is just as strong as the presence of death.
Well, I've always felt the Ninth Symphony is one of the most sophisticated dissolutions of metered time that we know in human existence. By the time you're at the end of the symphony, you have no more orientation to those successive moments of life. You have become part of the ether. It is the most extraordinary unraveling of rhythmic centricity that we need in music to understand, to know where our balance is. By the time this Ninth Symphony is over, you are unbalanced. You have been truly transported to some other place within your own consciousness. You are forced, whether you want to or not, to reflect on what it is to be a human being and alive.
I can't help feeling that it's a requiem for the child in some ways. I mean, I think he must have been still thinking about this child. And that's why there's the reference to Kindertotenlieder in it. Now, it's strange, isn't it, at the very end of that symphony that he should quote that very line about the children in the sunlight. Why did he suddenly think of that then?
Der Tag ist schön auf
The final twist of fate in Mahler's life occurred only months before his death. Finally, his music was beginning to achieve the recognition it deserved, and he was preparing for one of the highlights of his composing career, a performance of his massive Eighth Symphony. The strain of living with Mahler had taken its toll on Alma, who had become an alcoholic. While undergoing treatment at a sanatorium, she started a passionate affair with a young architect, Walter Gropius. Mahler was completely devastated by Alma's infidelity and blamed himself entirely for the affair. Paranoid with insecurity and guilt, he sought the help of the psychoanalyst, Sigmund Freud.
Mr. Freud said that I think the Alma's problem is you. If you relax a little bit with your obsession, probably your relationship with this lady is going to be easier. But I have a feeling that the man knew the nature of the lady, the beauty of the lady, and the character of the lady. So how could he trust a serene, quiet ending between the two of them? It's not possible. And I regret that this happened because it's very unfair when you are dying, when you have the great crisis as he had in the last years, physical crisis. It's very unfair, the whole story. I mean, nothing to say about Gropius, which I think was one of the greatest architects of his time, and great brain, actually. But the moment, the momentum where the whole thing happened is horrible, and the most tasteless thing I could ever think.
In the gloom of despair, knowing he'd lost the affection of his wife to a younger man, Mahler wrote his final symphony. Its heart-rending dissonances stretched the bounds of harmony and tonality to its limits.
The music is incredibly intense and passionate, and probably reflects this terrible guilt he had at the time that he'd almost lost Alma. And it was something, there was a terrible realization for him, and of course, as always, it was poured into the music. But it was achieved in such a refined way. The central climax of that adagio is extraordinary. It's like a series of piling up organ chords, one dissonance upon another. And here, with just these single trumpet note held absolutely like a knife through the heart, and then these anguished chords around it. Never was Mahler's grief, anguish, passion expressed more succinctly.
It was an extraordinary time of turmoil for him. And it finds its expression in the 10th Symphony, in the manuscript, with exclamations which are written in the score directly over the music, both of sort of terror, I think, the fear of losing her, and in the finale, an avowal of love for her written over the last bars. He writes, "Für dich leben, für dich sterben," to live for you, to die for you. And at the bottom of the page, his private name for his wife, Almschi.
Mahler never finished his 10th Symphony. He died on the 18th of May, 1911. He was 50. Mahler laid the foundations for modernism in music. His influence on Schoenberg, Berg, and Webern was colossal, but his lasting effect on the music of the whole of the 20th century has been immeasurable.
Mahler always wrote the music he wanted to write. He didn't follow fashions. He followed the dictates of his heart and soul. And in the process, he took music somewhere else.
His music takes one beyond what one is able to bear, because it's a relief and because it's a freedom.
It makes me live. I'm alive, I'm breathing, I know I'm alive when I'm listening to it. But I'm on a higher plane. Music is the most magical of arts, and Mahler is one of the most magical of its practitioners.